Welcome back, everybody, to something kind of special because there's no beer. We're starting on the Malazan crafting group. Once again, we're starting with a new project. I said that before, and now that I've finished Deadhouse Gates, I finished the scarf, I'll start on something new. And I figure I'll just show you how I start on this because it's kind of funny and I want to try that. So this is like the beginning of us talking about Memories of Ice and a new knitting project. And to start this off, I want to show you. So I bought new wool. I bought wool. We know wool is basically like drugs. It comes in really small packages, like, I don't know, 50 gram, that kind of thing, when you go to like a local crafting store. And that's not enough for what I want. So I went online and I bought a larger quantity. I bought 4 pounds of wool to start my next project. Now, how does 4 pounds of wool show up at your place? It shows up in this package, basically, which is big. Now, is this full of like these small bowls of wool that your cat's gonna play with? Of course not. When you open this up, it is. I'm gonna open this up and show you this. It's brimful with wool in these large, kind of packs. It smells of sheep, I can tell you that. And within those are these. It goes all the way down. You can see it goes all the way down. It's more wool and more wool and more wool. And how they are packed in there, I hope you can see that correctly, is you take one of those out. It's, I'll take this one, I suppose. Yeah, you take one of those things out, and they are, basically this wool is then tied together with strings, lots of strings in there, so it's gonna be a bit of a challenge to actually get all of this set up. I'll just, take this out. So I have like half of it now. I'll take this one because this seems smaller. Yep, so we have a lot of wool there. I'll just put this back in here and put it away for now. And now we have this large, basically long sausage of wool, which is super unpractical when you like want to actually knit with that stuff, right? Because the chances of like there's gonna be like knots in there, and then you have to like tear it apart and start over again and make a knot and start with the next thread is kind of not very practical, is what I'm trying to say. So what you do is you take that wool and you then like roll it up into a small kind of thing by yourself. Like you make these small wool bowls on your own. So we're going to do that. I'll just tear off this small thread, and suddenly we have another one, and we have this one, and I'll just put this one down in the box as well because we're going to start with one of them. And yeah, there's another one. So these are roughly 200 grams to, yeah, roughly 200 grams of wool in one of those. And you just start with the most boring job ever, which is find the actual end or like beginning of that. And each of those is once again tied together. So you have this, basically this ring of wool, which you can then, I don't know, put over your arm because you'll gotta do it, put it somewhere. And then you can start actually rolling this into a, how to say, a small ball of wool. And here we have one of those threads, and ideally we'll be smart about this. We'll see if that works. Yeah, I just tore it off. And there's another one down there somewhere, I suspect. No, there's not. We're good. All right, because now starts the real fun of what we got to do before we can actually start with the actual project, which will be a cape for Cal. And I'll just say this. I have no idea how to do that, and since I am, of course, unable to look at cool design ideas online and then just start doing them, I'll improvise. Have some fairly rough ideas of what I want it to look like. I mean, basically, the good part of like a cape is that it sort of looks like a towel that you knot around your neck in a way. But of course, it's got to be more fancy than that. We're talking a proper cowl, a proper cape here. So we'll see what kind of design idea I will come up with, because the other thing is, of course, you could just, knit like several larger parts of them individually. And if you do that, then just later sew them together. The secret there is I'm not good at sewing, because sewing is slightly more difficult to do when you're blind than is knitting, which you can literally do when you're blind, because you don't have to look at the actual thread and everything. It's just, you know, easier to do while not looking. I guess, I don't know, if you had like grandparents, grandmothers mostly who knitted, you probably remember them, like, I don't know, watching TV or talking to you and doing while knitting, and you're wondering how that works. Well, the answer is you don't have to look, as long as you don't do anything fancy and need to count how many stitches you take for whatever. So that's why I'm able to do the knitting stuff while I listen to audiobooks or whatever, because it helps me concentrate, because I do something with my hands which helps me think and concentrate in general. So yeah, that's what I'll do. I'll kind of, how to say, I'll improvise something and we'll see how that goes. And until then, but to start first, I need to start rolling those balls, and roll those balls I will for hours and hours as it looks. Although I'll just, do one, and then we'll start with the next one whenever I need one. I also turn this around because it looks like this is easier this way around. We'll see. So yeah, I suspect this is just, the beginning for this, and then we'll do a proper start with Memories of Ice. As I said before, I've listened to it like twice before, and sort of know what to do. Shit, you also should not drop that thing. Is what I'm trying to say here. Yeah. And I guess I'll talk to you real soon about Memories of Ice. Um, then once again, I suspect there will also be beer. I just like figured no beer today for rolling wool, because that I need both hands is what I'm trying to say here. So yeah, welcome back. And I've spent a very productive day turning all this wool into this, which is the first ball, and I'm gonna start knitting on it later today or tomorrow. We'll see, and then you can actually start seeing results. Isn't that fun? All right, but I obviously spent that time reading some more Memories of Ice, and so we already have something to talk about. So let's get into that. Cheers. And right off the bat, I need to say, I mean, this is my third read through, and I wasn't really aware of how much the tone shifts between Deadhouse Gates and Memories of Ice, and how much denser everything feels right now. Or maybe I just got denser. We don't know. But I'm like 3 chapters in right now, and there's so much to talk about in just the prologue on those first 3 chapters. It's just like it feels like so much more than within Deadhouse Gates or Gardens of the Moon, and there's already a lot going on there. So I don't know. Maybe I've gotten more attentive or I was less attentive during the first two books. We'll see. Anyway, I got to pick out like a couple of things I want to talk about today. And yeah, first of all, the timeline thing. This, as we already know, is basically the other half of Deadhouse Gates, or like the book that deals with events that happen at the same time as Deadhouse Gates. Because we're now back with other characters that we've seen before. We're back with the Bridge Burners, minus Kalam and Fiddler, obviously, but Whiskey Jack and Ganoas Paran and Tok the Younger is back among the kind of living. Although at the beginning he's just in company of Tool, so I'm not sure if that's the right word to use there. And oh boy, do they have some glorious dialogue. Tool is one of the dialogues between Tok and Tool, or general dialogues with Tool, are just among the best and driest humor in the entire series. So that's just a lot of fun. Anyway, so that's just a rough overview where we are right now, to make sure that some of the things I'm trying to say, to put them into kind of perspective. Anyway, lots of stuff to talk about. First of all, that prologue. Now, we know that, we've seen the prologue in those two other books, and they were good and everything. But compared to this one is just like, okay, let's go really far back. And we do. We have basically two prologues. We have the chaining slash the falling of the fallen god, and we have the end of one of the Jaghad wars. And those just give us the dimensions, or like the time depth that the Malazan world has. And there's stuff to be learned there. First of all, there's two really important things within that the Jaghad War part. First of all, remember Pran Cole, that Bonecaster? That's the guy from Krupp's whatever second dream, the one who helps with the turning finding a place for the spirit of Tattersail and Nightchill and all of that. That's the same Bonecaster. So that's just like an interesting, we've seen people before, and that's just cool. Now there's two things in there. There's one of course, that scene of the that they come upon when they start, which is the you have those wolves. We just call them wolves. Yeah, they have a different name. They're called A or whatever you want to call them, but they're basically wolves, or bigger wolves. And these Ranak, who, I don't know, or some kind of cow slash antelope, whatever herd animal that, gets eaten and so forth. And they are both stuck in a tar pit slash mud or whatever. And that's something that obviously happens in real life. Paleontologists dig up that kind of stuff all the time. But obviously it's also a metaphor, and the Talan at this point, like the Imas at this point, not yet Talan Imas, but only Imas at this point, are well aware of that in their discussion, which is once again that double level of metaphor that Steven Erikson does so well. Where you have the metaphor there, and if you're your typical college or high school kid, and you write your essay on literary analysis, you see that, and you have about the Jaghad War, and the Imas are hunting the Jaghad and destroying their own and dying in the process, and they come across these herd animals, these essentially peaceful animals, just like the Jaghad are essentially peaceful, bar obviously the tyrants, but and you see those and they're like, oh, there's a simile to be made there, and you write that in your essay, and your teacher is like, wow, you found it. And Erikson takes that and just makes the Imas actually already talk about that parallelism, but they don't, they kind of see it or don't see it, because they then come up with a different simile and a different interpretation of the whole thing. And yeah, but the idea generally of a hatred or hunger or drive that is so strong that it actually drives you into destruction. That's something that we need to keep in mind anyway within the series in general. So that's even outside of the idea of the Talan of the IMAS and the Jagad and the Eye and the Renak. So that's good to have that in there. This is like the first like cool scene idea that's in there that's cool to like look at and shows how yes you can write fantasy and have like cool thought pieces in there. I probably make a video on that at some point. We'll see. Anyway, that's one that stuck out in that first in that one prologue. The other one that I wanted to point out, and I mean, yeah, there's a lot more going on, but that's like what kind of stuck out is we meet Kilawa for the first time, who is awesome. And we find out at some point that she's actually the sister of Onos Tulan slash Tool, so that's also an interesting bit of world building in there, and so forth. We see her taking over those Jaghat children to save them, and then making a mistake by throwing them into that warren that is obviously not, we find out, not a Jaghat warren, so not Ontos Felak, but something else. I'm not going to say what it is because at this point we don't know. I don't want to spoil or anything. And then Prank Cole shows up. Also, incidentally, have you like recognized the point that he has like the silver fox as his totem animal, and that's something that was also in that scene where that child was born. The Rivi woman had that on her that on her body, and then was then the tattoo was gone once the child was born, and the child is now called Silver Fox. Yeah, you know, it's those small details that kind of explain stuff or just like show how well thought through some things are, which is something I would probably miss if I would ever decide to write something like that. So yeah, that's just a cool bit on the side. I got sidetracked already. Shit, that doesn't bode well. All right. Anyway, I wanted to go into something else. So she takes those kids and throws them into that warren because she thinks there's a Jackhuds in there who might just adopt those kids and so they can survive. Because obviously Kilawa is not very happy with IMAS kind as a whole at the moment. That moment being 300,000 years ago, but still. And then Prank Cole shows up as a fox, then turns into his like assembles into his human form or IMAS form, and they start talking, and he explains that she made that mistake, and then she gets angry at him, and that he says that, yeah, but like if you would actually have done what like if you're actually like, you know, how to say that, practice what you preach and so forth, because the kids are like, the kid's soul is now actually closing that wound in that warren. Remember, we saw that in Deadhouse Gates with that one Talan IMAS who gave Stormy the sword. He jumps up and like closed that rent in that warren. The same thing has happened here. Now, the thing he reveals, and keep that in mind because it is really important, is something closed that like rift before another soul. I really need to get back to that whole soul thing at some point. Anyway, so yeah, apparently at least one of those kids, maybe both of those souls, are now bridging that gap, and it's internal pain for them. It's probably worse than being killed by Talan IMAS, at least in general, because of like eternal pain seems to be more problematic than just to die, depending on what happens to your soul if you're a Jaghat, because we don't know at this point. Anyway, so philosophical arguments about what is better, if eternal life with pain is better than oblivion or something. We're not going to go into that. but so that has happened to the kids, and he then says like, hypocrisy ill suits you, Kilava, when she is outraged about what they have done to what they have done to the Jughead kids and so forth, and challenges her that if she actually preach like wants to practice what she preaches there, or actually act according to her moral standards, she would have to actually jump herself into that warren and free the kids, and yeah, take over the job of sealing that rent in the warrens between the worlds, which obviously she doesn't do. And now here's the question: whether that's correct. How, if like his moral, like if his challenge actually is correct or not on a moral level, is some kind of good question there, because you can try to do good without going to the absolute ends of your morality, in a way, the absolute brutal consequences of your morality. At least that's something that could happen. Now we know that the IMAS are not that kind of people, because they apparently figure that to actually reach a goal, it's totally justified to turn your entire people into undead warriors that live for hundreds of thousands of years, which, you know, I get kudos for the conviction there, but I'm not sure if that's a good thing to do. Anyway, so that was those two early scenes there. Then we have like a few other like smaller bits and pieces I think are really important. And the first one of those is in the other prologue. We have that thing where after all, like, you know, they see the devastation of the fallen god. We learn that they, like, some mages pulled down that god to destroy Calor, but couldn't do it. And he, because he knows that the Elder Guards are coming to actually punish him for what he has done, like, destroys his entire realm and everything, and kills everybody, because it's like, if I can't have it, no one shall. That kind of mentality, which is highly problematic. But we're gonna talk more about Calor on later points. Calor is a very interesting character overall, and I do sometimes feel kind of sorry for the bastard. Anyway, so, but he then curses Sister of Cold Night, who is obviously Nightchill, as we know at this point already. He curses Karul, and he curses Draconis. Now we see something that's kind of interesting, too, because they are talking about what they're planning to do and so forth, and Draconis talks about the fact that he has made a sword, or has almost finished a sword. And since Calor's curse was that he will die by that thing that he made, and Draconis explains that this is a sword that actually has a very, like, does more than just kill somebody, and we already know about that, since we already know about that sword. But the point is there that Karul says, so you better change the design. And Draconis says, yes, I'd better. Keep that in mind, that small half sentence there. Keep that in mind for later on. It might become more important, I suppose. So yeah, I just wanted to leave that in there as like a small, like, keep that in mind. It's something that I kind of ignored the first two throughs, and that just now popped into my mind. I'm like, oh, cool, interesting. And we're going to that scene. Well, there's not that much to say at this point. I believe there's not that much to say about Gruntle. We're introduced to new viewpoint characters there. We have Gruntle and the other caravan guards. They meet for the first time Ruth and Bud's favorite Beauchelin and Corboral Broach. And we figure out that they are obviously bad news, but we don't know exactly how bad. bad news they are yet, but they're like very cool. At least Boshalan's very cool. We see that apparently Moonspawn is on the rise somewhere. You know, all those things are just set up. This is, I figured there's not too much super important. I mean, there's probably tons of important stuff that I remember once we're done with this video. And this will obviously not be the last one on this first book of, of Memories of Ice. But yeah. But this part, I feel like there's more cool stuff going on, and a bit of world building, and just bringing us up to speed on where we are. And then we have that part with Tok coming out of the war, and we realize he's back alive, and he meets Tool there, and they have this amazing fun conversation, which just is so good. that opening, like when Lady Envy shows up with the wolves, and that conversation is so good in general. And like Tok tries to make this stupid jokes like, oh, does he come to greet you, or does he want you to throw one of your bones, undead soldier, and undead person? And undead person Tool is like, no, this is an eye, they only eat live food. And they each like make this stupid that's like humor, or at least an attempt at another humor. That's just like really good. Anyway, what I really found like an interesting point shortly after that is like in that situation when Tool explains about the eye almost dying. Remember, eye is that wolf from the prologue, right? You remember that? Good. So yeah, when we talk about them dying out of hunger because of overhunting and so forth, and then Tok makes this terrible comment about, I thought you would like not do that kind of shit because you're also like in harmony with nature and shit like that. And then Tool comes back at him and is like, are you that stupid, or are you just making a stupid joke here? And that is something that has several meanings, because there is this stupid idea, and we're going to come back to that on whole other levels again and again. There's this really problematic idea that that groups of people perceived as primitive or more primitive in a way, and I use primitive like not as something I would say, but you know, are more in tune with nature, and that gets romanticized by people in an industrialized civilization who are unhappy with their lot. You know, you have that. On the moral level, it boils down to that whole stupid trope of the noble savage, but you also have it, especially once we had some kind of environmental and awareness cropping up in Western or like Northern Atlantic societies. Once we had that cropping up, it's all this like, oh, those indigenous people, and all those terms are problematic. I mean, I'm just like dropping them out here because I'm sort of kind of paraphrasing here, but you know, they're so in touch with nature and they understand, and then suddenly people dress up in bed sheets and wave around golden sickles and make like professors of Celtic studies cry and laugh hysterically, and all this other stuff. This whole idea of being more in touch with nature, and the idea that technology or civilization and cultural progress puts humans further away from nature, whatever nature is. And so to have that comment in there is like, yeah, you look at terrible old anthropology from the 19th century, I don't know, you have exactly that kind of view as well. It's just not true. We luckily know that by now. But anyway, and Tool is demolishing that very thoroughly and in his typical like dry way, and goes back to this like, yeah, like even the lichen on the tundra is like, it's all just war for dominance, which also obviously tells you a lot about the mindset that led to something like the Jughead Wars, and obviously all of that is in there. It's not that I like morally or whatever condone Tool's perspective here. It's just like that he manages to, with like putting forward his perspective there, he manages to demolish that romanticizing view on groups of people that are perceived as more as more primitive, is what I'm trying to say there. So yeah, that was like a big one for me. Like, oh, that's cool. I just love that. That's just cool. Then we have some more Segula stuff. Keep in mind all the stuff you learn about the Segula here. There's a lot of stuff dropped here that you later on get like re-revealed and sometimes think you've never heard that before, but actually there's a lot of stuff actually dumped, like almost info dumped here in that opening scene when Envy and Talk are talking in that tower. So yeah, that's like the one thing I wanted to talk about today. The other big thing, and now it's gonna get like a bit more serious, like not more serious, but interesting things in chapter 2. All right. So the big thing in chapter 2 for me is like the beginning, that interaction with Blend and Picker. Blend and Picker are cool. Like some of my favorite characters might be Picker and Blend in a way for several reasons. They're once again like your average day soldiers and so forth. They might also be one of the best written relationships, relations, friendships, whatever at this point within the Malazan series. You know that some people criticize or say that Steven Erikson can't write romances properly. I wouldn't go that far. Just like say, keep an eye on Blend and Picker. That might get interesting how that develops there. Anyway, not what what I wanted to say any at this point. What I wanted to talk about is more after that artist hands those torques to Picker, who puts them on, can't get them off, and so forth, which is also important. And there's an interesting thing going on there that I'm not sure I can talk about now without spoiling anything. Maybe I'll do it anyway in a minute. All right. And then we see that he's actually on a very different way because he's apparently changing into a warren where he meets someone who seems to be a god, a broken god. And yeah, I mean, I don't think it's kind of completely made clear at this point, but I think it's sort of obvious. So I probably won't spoil anything. There's this, because we're also talking about the chains and everything already. This is oh no, he's called the crippled god at some point there. But yeah, that's the guy who fell down onto the earth during that first prologue, and I hope I didn't spoil anything here. But I figured this is something you can also come up with while reading it for the first time, because it's so shortly after that after that prologue. Anyway, so he's in that warren. He's talking to that god. He made did a job for that god. Apparently, he did create a deck of dragons, or parts of a deck of dragons, and we'll see why that is important later on, like plot wise and like world building wise and all of that. And I'll probably get back to that at some point. But I feel like I've spoken about that in like a different video, and I don't want to make this like an ongoing whatever like theme, but the conversation that Monarch, or whatever his name is, the artist has with the crippled god there, on brokenness and loneliness. That one is a very poignant thing. On several levels. And I'm not going to judge here in any way. I try not to judge there. Because it's much too early to judge on anything here. But the conversation they have there is like there's small flaws in each of them. They're broken. You put so much in there. And all of them have this mean of loneliness there. You put so much in of your own brokenness in there. And there is a lot of stuff to unpack here that I'm not sure I'm qualified to really talk about, or I don't know. So the point is that with brokenness, and in this case, we already know that like the god is obviously broken, but also Munok, because yeah, we all know at that point he has some kind of tumors and all kinds of stuff. So he's also broken in a certain way. And then with brokenness comes loneliness. And that's something that is a very important point and one that's really difficult and hard to talk about in a way for me. Because the problem there is that brokenness is just one of the things, or like to call something broken. But the point is that loneliness can come from several things. And if you are broken in a way, usually everyone is broken in their own way. That's the other part. Everyone is broken in their own way, but brokenness or that kind of thing is something that comes between a an individual and the perceived rest of society. Now, don't get me wrong. I know that in the end, and this is like that's one of the things that makes it so difficult to talk about that, is like in the end everyone feels themselves to be an individual and feels themselves to and has these situations where you sometimes feel that the rest of the world doesn't understand you, the rest of the world is way different from you, and you have like that's where loneliness comes from in the end. Loneliness usually is the idea of not belonging to a whole. And I suspect we all feel lonely sooner or later for whatever reason. This idea of being alone and being misunderstood or being not able to like or being not able to connect to the rest of humankind is something that we all have. Now what becomes more problematic there is that having some kind of visible or like easily recognizable thing that makes you broken in a way makes this separation from the rest of a society, from the rest of humankind, much more perceivable, much more open, much more apparent is the word that I'm looking for. Much more apparent to yourself and to the rest of society. It makes it much more difficult, like, because in the end, what it all boils down, sorry, I'm kind of meandering here, but what it boils down to is that we are not separate from the rest of humankind because we're all human. So it's a perceived separation. It's something that we, as individuals, in the moment when we feel we're lonely, usually, I mean, obviously, there's also like, you know, societal pressures and shit like that. I'm not saying that shit doesn't exist. But for the feeling of loneliness, a lot of that is me or you or us perceiving ourselves as being separated from society for whatever reasons. And the problem is that with that kind of brokenness that is more apparent than other brokenness, because the idea that we are all kind of broken or damaged at some point, I'm not gonna, go too deeply into that right now. But what I'm trying to say is that we are with that kind of recognizable brokenness, like a handicap, disability, illness, whatever, it is much more difficult to overcome the feeling of being separated from the rest of humanity. It is much more difficult to overcome that because it's much more prominent in a way. This goes for all kinds of like things like stigmata, basically, because what it boils down to is that I shouldn't say stigmata because that's a different thing. I'm not going to do theology here. But what I'm saying is those things are often on the other side also from society viewed as stigmata, basically, whether it's mental or physical handicaps. So it's much more difficult to overcome that, and to have that put in there is very, very important there, and speaks to me in a very personal way also. Just, yeah. Which makes it kind of difficult to talk about that, because I don't know how to vocalize that in a way that doesn't sound super egocentrical and all of that. Anyway, the next bit though is also very important there, because we see two reflexes there. that our reactions on being separated and being separated from the rest of humankind, or I'll just use humankind, even though there's different species, and the crippled god is obviously a god and not just a human. But you see what I mean? Of being separated from the whole. I'll just do it that way. And there's two things there. On the one hand, this pain that comes from being separated, or quite like literally physical pain that the crippled god seems to feel. And we're not going to talk about how gods who are basically a spiritual being or whatever can feel a physical pain, but that aside, that can lead to two things. There's one mechanism that is shown here is like the cruelty of like the revenge rage kind of way to go, which is like, if I feel broken and terrible and so forth, I'm gonna make the rest also hurt. And that's something that you see here, at least in this scene. It's not gonna be, at least in this scene, it's something that you can see from the crippled god. And then you have the other side, which is Munach, who is like, I feel that I deserve that despair. I deserve that pain. I deserve that despair, and that's like the other big reflex that comes oftentimes from that. And both of them are highly problematic and probably not the best way to deal with pain and the idea of loneliness and being separated from the whole of humankind. But both of them are very happen very often. And I find it very important, like, first of all, that Steven Erikson puts that whole idea that it's just a small flaw on each image, which then is reflected by this feeling of loneliness, but it's a visible flaw. It's a visible flaw that makes this for everyone like recognizable. And then to have shown those two highly problematic ways of dealing with a feeling of loneliness and being separate and broken. That's just very, very powerful. And we're going to get back to that a lot more, because I feel like I already forgot something super vital about Quickman's interaction with the crippled god afterwards, which I hopefully remember for the next video. And I think I'll just leave it at that for today. This is just like the first observation from actually just the first two chapters. There's more coming for chapter 3 and 4, I suppose. We'll see. For the next video tomorrow, when we have hopefully started to actually do some knitting on that thing with that big ball that I just made. Until then, I hope you have a great time, and I'll talk to you real soon. Cheers.